Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm a little bit late getting this up tonight because I had car issues today. And my son in law, as awesome as he is just wonderful. He's been here working on it. So I've kind of gotten behind in my recording for this week's episode or this week's update from the Alex Murdaugh murder trial. But I'm bringing it to you now. Now, if I'm not mistaken, this is the end of week 4. And you may already know this, but the prosecution finally rested their case on Friday. There was a long list of witnesses that they called. And like I said, they ended it on Friday. And the defense has already called 2 witnesses. And honestly, I believe that this may be the last week. I could be mistaken, but yeah, I believe this is going to be the last week of this trial. But anyway, y'all, let's get this episode started. So this week started off with an announcement that 2 of the jurors were dismissed due to testing positive for COVID-19. And of course, there were alternates to take their place, but that leaves only 3 alternates. Now, both the defense and the prosecution agreed that although they're ready to get this trial wrapped up, they would completely understand if the trial needed to take a break for a couple of days to try and prevent COVID from wiping out the entire jury and the alternates. Now, Judge Newman said that the remaining jurors had been tested, but their results were negative, and they would be tested again on Wednesday. And he went on to say that they would wait on those results to make any decisions and encourage those in attendance to wear a mask to protect themselves. And also on Monday, pathologist Dr. Ellen Reimer, she testified about the details from the autopsies of Paul and Maggie Murdaugh. And I do want to warn you now that some of the details from those autopsies were pretty graphic. Now, she said that the shots that killed them were at close range. And in her testimony, she said that Paul was shot twice with a shotgun. The first of the 2 shots grazed his chest with pellets, but the second shot was to his head. And it was such a violent wound that it left his skull nearly empty. She also said that the wound to Paul's head was so brutal that, quote, his brain was ejected out of the right top side of his head and arrived to the autopsy in a separate bucket, end quote. Now that shot entered through his shoulder and exited through his head. Maggie was hit with either 4 or 5 bullets. Her first 2 wounds happened as she was facing the shooter, but those weren't the fatal shots. But one of those shots did hit her kidney. And Reimer surmised that would have been a painful wound and would have caused Maggie to double over in pain. And while she was doubled over, facing away from the shooter, the fatal shot went through her chest and into her face. Maggie's brain was also destroyed. Now, I was watching as the pathologist described to the jury what they were seeing in some photos that the prosecution had put up. And it was pretty graphic, but I was mainly focused on Alex Murdaugh's reactions to what he was hearing. Now, at times he appeared to cry, and I'm not saying that he didn't or he did, but, we know from so many other cases that a lot of times those accused will only appear to cry. And I will say that his face was very red, and my face turns that shade of red while I'm crying. And I'm just going to leave my opinion of his reaction at that. But I also noticed that he was very antsy and fidgety, and he had a yellow highlighter that he kept fiddling around with, and he seemed so distracted that it took a few seconds for him to stand up when the bailiff announced for the courtroom to rise as Judge Newman left the bench at the end of the day. Well, then on Tuesday, Dr. Reimer wrapped up her graphic testimony for the prosecution, and then she was cross-examined by the defense. And after Reimer was dismissed from the stand, the prosecution called a last-minute witness to question about some additional evidence they wanted to present from Alex Murdaugh's Chevy Suburban. The last-minute witness works for GM, and his name is Devin Newell. And on the night of the murders, Murdaugh says that he drove around quite a bit, and the prosecution says that was only to establish a false alibi. Well, Newell took the stand to explain the data that was found over the weekend that GM said, or they had said in the past, that they didn't have that data when a search warrant was served for it. Well, after Newell's testimony, the next to take the stand was Roger Davis, who was a groundskeeper at Moselle, but his main responsibility was taking care of the dogs on the property. And his testimony provided a look into the type of person that Maggie was. Davis said that she really loved those dogs and she spent a lot of time with them. And he also said that she was this very laid-back lady and she was easy to talk to. Now, Davis also described his duties that he had to perform while taking care of the dogs, and one of those duties was washing out the kennels with a yellow water hose. And once he was finished with the hose, he would roll it back up, but he did it in a certain way so that it didn't kink up when he hung it back up to dry, or when he hung it back up when he was finished with it. And Ariel's back there giving her commentary too. But anyway, in a picture that was shown to Davis, it depicts that yellow hose with kinks in it, to which Davis explained that someone had to use it after him and they didn't put it back up correctly. And he also pointed out more of what could be some pretty damning evidence. Now, in other pictures, Davis pointed out the kennels with the feed room at the far end of them. And he explained that water would puddle under the hose and under one of the dog pens. But in the photos, it shows water puddled near that feed room. And also pointed out that there was too much water in front of two of the dogs' pens, which never happens. So, y'all, this is just my opinion, but I believe the point of all that was to say that someone else had used the water hose long after Davis had left for the day, and just maybe it was whoever had killed Paul and Maggie, and they were using it to maybe wash off evidence. But that's just my thought, and it was not mentioned in court. Now, Davis's testimony was followed by a forensic accountant to the state of South Carolina grand jury, and his name was Carson Burney. Now, Burney's testimony basically backed up Annette Griswold's testimony from last week, or the week before, about the fake Forge account, and provided more details about how money was directed to that Forge account and another account at Palmetto State Bank. Now, following his testimony, Maggie Murdaugh's older sister, Marion Proctor, took the stand. Proctor talked about how she and Maggie had been close, especially after they both had gotten married and had children. She also described Paul as being a very sweet kid, and he had been villainized by the media after the boating accident. She described how their lives changed after that boat accident, saying that she felt that the community there had turned against them. Her testimony also included what she knew about June the 7th. She said that Maggie had called her around 4 that afternoon and told her that Alex wanted her and Paul to come home. So Proctor thought that maybe Alex wanted them to go visit with his dad with him since he was in bad health. She didn't think much more of it until later that night when she and her husband were at home watching a movie, and her husband received a text from Alex's brother, Randy. That text said that there had been a tragedy and he needed to call him back. And that's when she learned of the murders. So from there, Miss Proctor and her husband drove to Somerville so that they could tell her and Maggie's parents about what had happened. Well, then over the following days, Proctor and her husband was at the Moselle property a lot, making funeral arrangements. And when she talked to Alex about the murders, he told her that neither Maggie or Paul had suffered for very long. And when she asked him if he had any idea who would have done this, he said that he felt that whoever had did it had thought about doing it for a long time, but she didn't know what he meant by that. Her husband, Bart, testified after her, and he was the last witness on the stand on Tuesday. Now, Miss Proctor, in my opinion, her testimony was quite heartbreaking to watch, but I'm going to include the link to it in the episode description so you can watch that later. All right, now I know that's already been a lot to absorb because we're only up to Tuesday or through Tuesday. And I know these updates are long, but there's just so much to them, and I really don't want to leave out anything. All right, so now we're into Wednesday. And after the jury all tested negative for COVID, like I said, they were going to be retested on Wednesday, and they all retested negative. That day started off with Judge Newman hearing arguments from both sides about including evidence from Murdaugh's alleged insurance scheme, as in when it's believed that Alex Murdaugh paid Curtis Eddie Smith a substantial amount of money to appear as the trigger man during that roadside shooting on Labor Day weekend. Judge Newman at first decided to not allow that evidence, but later he changed his mind because the defense team brought it up during cross-examination of a SLED agent, and that SLED agent was David Owen. And Owen was made the lead investigator of the murder investigation once SLED took control of the investigation from the Colleton County Sheriff's Office. During that cross-examination, Owen was asked by the defense team member, Jim Griffin, if he knew that Murdaugh was paying Curtis Eddie Smith up to $50,000 a week for drugs, and then went on to say that Smith was skimming money from Murdaugh that was meant for a drug gang, offering the debt as a motive for someone other than Alex Murdaugh to be behind the murders. Well, Owen testified that the drug gang wasn't worried about the money because they knew they would get paid, and went on to say that neither the gang nor Smith was mentioned in any of the three interviews he had had with Murdaugh. And I believe that is what the defense was getting at, was maybe the murders of Paul and Maggie were gang-related because of a drug debt. Well, the jury was shown video of that interview, and in that video, Murdaugh was shown the Snapchat video from Paul's phone, and you can hear Owen ask Murdaugh when he changed clothes. Well, before answering, Murdaugh asked what time the video was taken, and when he got the answer, he responded with, quote, "I guess I changed when I got back to the house," end quote. Well, after answering Owen's questions about if he killed his wife and son or knew who did, the answer was no. He then asked Owen if he was being considered as a suspect. Well, Owen answered him with, quote, "I have to go where the evidence and the facts take me, and I don't have anything that points to anybody else at this time," end quote. While still on the stand, Owen said that the inconsistencies between the three interviews were significant to his case against Murdaugh, and the defense team tried to discredit Owen's statement or testimony by saying that SLED's investigation never considered anyone else a suspect in the murders. And y'all, that was pretty much it for Wednesday. And then on to Thursday, the day started off with defense counsel Jim Griffin objecting. I can't talk tonight, and I do apologize. But Thursday, I'm going to start that sentence over again. Thursday, the day started off with defense counsel Jim Griffin objecting to Judge Newman's decision to allow testimony in regards to the roadside shooting. And even though they, as in the defense, was the one that mentioned it when they cross-examined SLED agent David Owen the previous day. Y'all, I don't know what's up with this defense team, but that just don't make any sense at all to me for them to object to something that they had already brought up. But anyway, now David Grubbs, who is a chief forensic examiner at the South Carolina Attorney General's office and is certified in Cellbrite data and is an expert in cell phone forensics, gave testimony in regards to all the cell phones that he analyzed for this case. His testimony included the following. On June the 7th, Paul's cell phone battery died. at 10:34 p.m. And the last text message received on his phone was from his friend Rogan Gibson between 9 and 10 o'clock that night that read, "Yo." Now, as far as Maggie's phone, a record from 8:53 to 9:08 p.m. shows that her phone was locked at that time and remained locked until the following day. The defense did not cross-examine Grubbs. Now, Dr. Kinsey, who is the chief of detectives at Orangeburg County Sheriff's Office, testified also on Thursday, and he said in his testimony that he has processed over 800 death scenes in the span of his career, and he has done some consulting for homicide cases. Kinsey said that he did a reconstruction of the crime scene from the murders of Paul and Maggie using collected evidence, measurements from the scene, and his own personal investigation. What he found was that the shooter's location couldn't be exactly established in the shooting of Paul, but he did say that the area where you load the gun or the shotgun was inside the door of the shed. He also said that after Paul was shot the first time, he was still standing for a brief time and he was slowly moving. After the second shot, he stopped moving. And as far as Maggie's wounds, he said that the third one is the one that brought her down to the ground and came from behind. The fourth was shot while the shooter was standing above her and came from in front of her and to the crown of her head. And he also told the courtroom that there were no defensive wounds on neither Maggie nor Paul. Well, after the lunch break, SLED Senior Special Agent Ryan Kelly took the witness stand. Kelly was one of the officers who responded to the roadside incident where Murdaugh was shot in the head. Murdaugh had been driving Maggie's black Mercedes SUV when it got a flat tire on the driver's side. Kelly said that after viewing the flat tire, he found that the tire had a small hole in it that had been created by a pocket knife or something comparable. And the 911 call that Murdaugh played for the jury while Kelly was on the stand, and you can hear Murdaugh telling the operator that he had a flat tire. He pulled over, then another vehicle pulled over, and a person that was in that vehicle got out of it and shot him somewhere in the head. After that, Murdaugh was flown to a hospital in Savannah, and Kelly went to that hospital and talked to Murdaugh and his brother Randy. Well, while he was there, Murdaugh relayed to him what he had told the 911 operator. And he also testified that agents continued to search the area for anything that could have caused the tire to go flat, and they were able to locate a gray utility knife. When it was tested for DNA, there were matches to Murdaugh and Curtis Eddie Smith. 2 days after that shooting, a sketch artist visited Murdaugh in his hospital room, and with Murdaugh's description, they were able to come up with a composite drawing of who Murdaugh said had shot him. Well, that same day, Randy Murdaugh spoke with Agent Owen and told him that Alex had been making calls to an unknown number and had been offering money to the hospital staff to allow him to make phone calls. That phone number was traced to Curtis Eddie Smith. And he also stated that the former housekeeper, Blanca Simpson, had been contacted by Alex Murdaugh before the roadside shooting, and he was asking her to locate insurance cards for him. And Kelly's testimony was rather lengthy, and it included a lot of bombshells. So what I'm going to do is also include the link to his testimony in the episode description. Okay, y'all, we're finally up to Friday. So Friday started with the cross-examination. See, I'm telling y'all, something's wrong with me. But anyway, it started with the cross-examination of Agent Ryan Kelly by defense attorney Dick Harpootlian. And Harpootlian started out his cross-examination by asking Kelly questions about if he knew what Murdaugh's medical condition was when he interviewed him in the hospital. But Kelly responded with that they were still doing testing for for all of his wounds. And at that time, he did not know the extent of Murdaugh's injuries when that interview took place. Well, Harpootlian also asked Kelly if he had viewed records from the rehab that Murdaugh had went to in Atlanta, but Kelly said he hadn't because of problems getting medical records from out of state. Then Harpootlian moved on to questions about the phone interview with Murdaugh while he was still in rehab. During that interview, Murdaugh admitted to stealing money, drug abuse, and that he had lied previously, which led to Murdaugh being charged with insurance fraud, financial fraud, and filing a false statement. Now, basically, in my opinion, Harpootlian questioned Kelly about Murdaugh's medical condition during the hospital interview to say that Murdaugh wasn't medically competent to be interviewed for a crime. Now, when the prosecution questioned Kelly during their redirect, Kelly made it clear that Murdaugh was competent for the hospital questioning. SLED Special Agent Peter Radofsky also took the stand on Friday, and he explained the timeline that he had been able to create using cell phone data. And he also discussed the information that had been handed over by GM from Murdaugh's Suburban. And Radofsky used that information along with a Google Earth map to show the jury the routes that had been taken in the Suburban on June 7th. And another bit of information that Radofsky presented that I found interesting was data from Alex Murdaugh's phone about his steps per minute. And throughout most of the day, Murdaugh's steps per minute had been normal with no more than 31 steps per minute. But between 9:02 p.m. and 9:06 p.m., for some reason, his steps per minute increased to nearly 71 steps per minute, with a total of 283 steps in that 4-minute span. Cross-examination by the defense was basically breaking down the cell phone data further. After Radofsky's testimony, the state rested its case. And the defense called their first witness after Radofsky, and their first witness was Coroner Richard Harvey. And in his testimony, he stated that he gave a time of death for 9 p.m. for Maggie and Paul Murdaugh, and that he arrived at that time by checking the body temperature under their armpits. He checked for rigor, which there was none. And in the case of no rigor, then time of death was usually around 1 to 3 hours. So, or 1 to 3 hours ago. He also stated that they could have died at 8 or 10 p.m., given that logic. And on the cross-examination, he was asked if he didn't have a general time that the deaths had occurred because he didn't take a rectal temperature, to which he said yes. The second of the defense's witnesses to take the stand was Shailene Tyndall. He was the public information officer for the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office. She was questioned about an article in the Post and Courier on June the 8th, and their main focus was about a quote from her that said that the public had nothing to worry about, meaning there was no threat to the public after the murders. Harpootlian asked her how that quote came about, and she explained that it was a joint statement from SLED and the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office that SLED had signed off on before she released it to the press. And in the cross-examination by the prosecution, Tyndall was asked about the times that the information was released to the press. And y'all, that's it for week 4. I say like that wasn't much, but it was. Now, like I said, the defense has already called 2 witnesses and gone through them that fast. So I'm hoping or thinking that this may be the last week of this trial, but we'll see. Now, court will not reconvene until Tuesday morning of this week because, like I said, or like we all know, Monday is a holiday. But also, one thing I want to mention before we go is that my sister, Jody, she sat in on this Murdaugh trial on Thursday afternoon and then all day on Friday this past week. So she's agreed to talk with us about it a bit and tell us what it's like actually being there. And I'm pretty excited about that. So I'm going to have that up in the next week or so. Just depends on when we both have time at the same time to get this done. But anyway, y'all, that's all I've got for this episode or this update. Y'all have a good night.